Okay, well, thanks for pressing the link there to join our conversation with Steve Moore, who is going to be retiring awfully soon, is in the process of retiring. We'll talk to Steve about that, as CEO and Executive Director of the M.J. Murdock Charitable Trust, for where he has worked, for which he has worked for some 16 years. So there's going to be some perspective we're getting from Steve today. First, then let's start. Steve, why don't you tell me about Jack Murdock and how he generated his wealth?
Yeah, that's great. I love talking about Jack Murdock. Jack was an early entrepreneur. Prior to World War II, he took, his parents said they had saved a little money for him he could either go to college or he could start a business. And he decided to start a little radio and TV business. It was kind of a booming technology at that time.
Yeah.
And eventually a student walked in that wanted some part-time work. His name was Howard Vollum. And he worked at repairing radios and TV. And they became good friends. World War II hit. They decided to go off into the military like the great generation did, and to learn everything they could about the technology. They knew that there was a lot of technology. Jack went to the Coast Guard, Howard went to Army, and they both got into all the technology stuff that was there. When they came back, they realized that there was a lot of surplus material that they could kind of cannibalize, and they saw this great need for technology, particularly a portable oscilloscope. And so they created a portable oscilloscope and recreated their business to be called Tektronix, an early tech entrepreneur. They also loved working with other entrepreneurs. So they brought lots of people into this business. It grew rapidly. It went public, and Jack and Howard became multimillionaires, as did several other people in the company. And they continued to run Tektronix. Jack was not married, and Howard was married, had some boys who we're still in touch with at the Murdock Trust. And they were also very generous. They encouraged employees, if they had ideas, to start businesses. And so they would let them actually work on their own time, but use Tektronix equipment to start businesses. And so literally hundreds of businesses were spun off out of Tektronix. And so that's really the source of Jack's wealth. I can say more about how he got to philanthropy, but that gives you an idea about his wealth. So they encouraged a lot of other folks to come to the Pacific Northwest. They had a couple of friends they'd met in the military that were in California that kept saying, come to California. And they kept saying, come to Portland in the Northwest. Those two guys were called Hewlett and Packard.
Yeah.
And Vollum and Murdock wanted to, so they created what we know the Silicon Valley. And of course, what was created up here was the Silicon Forest.
Yeah.
Intel, Mentor Graphics, many other groups were created for them.
Yeah. So when did Jack die? And I guess when did Howard die?
Yeah. So Jack was an avid outdoor enthusiast and inventor. He bought land. He invested in a variety of things. He loved flying. He was a pilot, and he, loved to fly. He had a float plane that he loved, and some other planes. And he tragically died in a plane accident on the Columbia River in 1971. And just months prior, he had written his will because a couple of best friends had said to him, if you die, everything goes to the government.
Yeah.
And so he immediately put down a mission statement and created a trust that if anything ever happened to him, and unbeknownst to him, it was going to happen sooner than he thought.
Yeah.
When he died and the trust was founded in 1975, there was about $91 million in his total estate that went in to create the Murdock Trust.
Are there board members now that knew him then? I assume no, but I don't know.
Well, one of our board members knew him as a young teenager. And he would be what we call second generation trustees. The first generation trustees have all passed away. Two of our second generation have passed away. And we're now into our third generation, two third generation trustees.
Yeah.
So that was in fact an issue when I first came to the Murdock Trust. I realized as I began to try to identify some of Jack Murdock's peers, because I wanted to interview them. And as I began to interview them, I realized they were all in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s. So I began to take a small video crew with me and video interview and just say, tell me about Jack. Tell me about what he loved. Tell me about what he laughed about. Tell me those kinds of things. And so we got some incredible footage of people that knew Jack, were friends of Jack, understood things he cared about. That was incredibly helpful to us.
Yeah. Is the trust looking for perpetuity or spend out or what?
Great question. And here's one of the many things that I think is very thoughtful of Jack Murdock, is that he gave the trustees the opportunity to spend out if they decided to at any point in the history. He also gave the opportunity to go in perpetuity. And our trustees right now, our planning is based upon in perpetuity.
Yeah.
So we are trying to plan with a long view in mind, and not just what can we do now, but what can we do in 30 years.
Is this an issue revisited annually, every 5
on a regular basis? When we revisit our strategic directive, we are always asking ourselves those kinds of things. And are there things that might ask us to consider to reconsider?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of thing we talk about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, did Jack have an ideological worldview that could?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the word ideological, I think, is a unusual word in our time. I would say every organization and trust and foundation I know works from particularized values, particularly a trust that is a testamentary trust. And Jack, we've really sought to be true to his values and commitments. And so those absolutely are things we think about, talk about, understand, and have, are always asking ourselves, are we being Murdockish? Are we doing things in a sense in the spirit of Jack Murdock? And one of the great things he said is, I don't know what the world would be like 40 years from now. I've got to count on the trustees and the staff that are working 40 years from now to do the kind of things that we should be doing at that time, and to reflect the kind of ways that we would work that are consistent with who we are.
Now, Steve, as you know, there would be no shortage of people who would recommend against such trust being placed in future, I'll say, boards or staffs.
Yeah.
A risk not worth taking, but
Yeah.
He took it and you're kind of taking it. The trust is taking it.
Yeah.
How's that going?
Yeah. Great question. That's another great question. I would say that it's going very well. And the reason is that we don't treat his legacy or his donor intent in a sterile, brittle, fossilized kind of a way. We treat it as a living, organic, very robust way with very particularized DNA. So we try to stay true to the kinds of principles and commitments that Jack would have, but we also try to really understand the world that we're in, and and to be true in that way.
Yeah. You came to the trust from the academy.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us where in the academy and why you came and sort of how?
Yeah. I was very resistant to coming to work at a foundation. It was a funny kind of a thing. turned down jobs at some foundations and at the Murdock Trust a couple of times. My background, I did, my PhD is in philosophy and in higher education, and I've got theology and law in my background. And so I've got a kind of a diverse, what you might call liberal arts background. And so I love and still love higher education. I feel like it's at a very formative time in people's lives, and that ideas matter. I think that's a really important thing. They have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. Good ideas have good consequences. And so those kinds of things really matter. The thing that happened finally is that one of the trustees at the Murdock Trust said, I think things you care about, the streams of your life, come together in our work in a way that, if you would think about it, could be a very fruitful season of your life. And so my wife very wisely said, I think there's some truth to that. I think you need to stop and look at that. And so, the idea that ideas matter, the idea that, organizations and leaders are ways to form and impact culture. And of course, Murdock works a lot with higher ed. So, that's a very good thing. But we also work in a variety of sectors. We work in arts and culture. We work in science research, and we work in health and human services, which are all areas that I care about and love. They're what you might call parts of the ecosystem that are important to give care to. And so that's really the thing that finally drew me here. And Murdock is also particularly interested in supporting, encouraging, developing leaders. And so that's been a long interest of mine as well.
Any similarities between the Academy and philanthropy? I worked for a program vice president at Bradley who came to the Academy.
Yeah.
Would often see similarities with whatever it might be. But what might you think about that?
I think there can be. I wouldn't say it's true of all philanthropy, but I think it would be true to some degree of Murdock and, several others. And I think that, again, I think it's the fact that ideas matter. I think that's a very important thing. I think that the idea of good project planning and execution, that's very true in the Academy. I think the difference is that we are focused primarily in our grants through building the capacity of organizations to fulfill their mission. So I'd say in most higher education institutions, they're seeking to fulfill their mission by delivering an educational experience that helps students be formed in a way that they can, go out into society. So that's probably the biggest difference, but there are some similarity. I think one big difference here is that I think we move at a much faster speed than most higher education does. Although I'm seeing a lot of higher ed having to shift now, and I think that we also value collaboration, and I think sometimes higher ed can value that, but oftentimes it can be very isolated.
What does it say about the trust, if anything, that your successor, who's been chosen and announced, used to work there?
Yeah, that's great. I don't know. I'll leave it to others to maybe judge what it says. I think that one of the things that we have always been committed to is that we want our organization to reflect the communities we serve. And we try to find people who are a part of our team, and we're sort of always seeking to equip and train and give them experiences that they in turn may go lead in other places in other ways. And that certainly ended up being the case with Romanita going to work at Microsoft in their philanthropic sector and to work there. But we've had others from our team that have gone other places. And given great leadership as well. So we also like people whose backgrounds are very diverse, so that we're not all people coming from higher ed. We're not all people that have always worked in philanthropy, which that I think we've got people that come from a wide variety of backgrounds, from economic development to historic preservation to New York Stock Exchange to, a variety of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Why don't we finish up with part one there and get to part two in a bit here?
That sounds good.